Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Church is Stupid.
Comma but.
I'm Andy.
I'm Ruth, and with us we have our special guest returning for our second episode of the week, Heidi.
Thank you for having me again. This is fun.
We're having a ton of fun, and so we're going to be diving right back into our conversation on the different ways that different generations view church. And as a reminder, we represent 3 different generations here, and just diving right in. Last week we talked about Heidi's experience where you kind of we're at a time where it wasn't the big boom of church. It had kind of gone down, but it was starting to kind of come up. Andy, you had been to a couple of different experiences, but you'd never really seen a full sanctuary. And myself, who mostly sat in older churches that were not really that full. Except for, I will say, when I was a child growing up, I know that the church I attended as a kid was really full. And we did this thing, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it. It's called March for Jesus. And it was...
I
don't know if they still even do it, but in Goshen, Indiana, they used to have a big mile-long parade of worship music. So there would be all these floats, and you would just be singing praise, like walking a mile down the street. Okay, why you laughing at me?
I pictured this as in grade school we did a McDonald's walkathon kind of thing where you got these like little plastic feet for walking a mile. And that's what I thought this was.
Not quite that. No, it was actually a whole bunch of people would just, from a bunch of different churches. And I remember my dad used to, because he really wanted to be a worship leader for a long time. So he used to sing on one of the floats. So I felt really cool because there's my dad. I'd be right there. But that was also in the March for Jesus. This is too much information, so you're welcome. Was the time where I wondered for the first time, how can you breathe and sing at the same time?
Well, you got to breathe on the down.
That's my memories of the March
and
for
walk,
Jesus.
and you're marching too.
Right. So that was it was definitely a culture shift for me, going from that much, especially liveliness, right? That you have when you have that many, because it wasn't a small event. It was a lot of people.
And that's true. I just want to interject. Yeah. I'm interrupting, but I do that really well.
Yeah.
But the big events became really popular, as I can think of, as churches maybe were kind of not getting the attendance like Andy's talking about. Even in my generation, there would be like these events like Promise Keepers, which brought like men together to say, this is how we're going to be men of God, or like Women of Faith conferences, or Billy Graham crusades, or there were these events that were kind of out of the church building. And I do think that there was something to that, because maybe to a degree, the building and the stigma of the building had gotten a bad rap. And so these events in arenas and, football stadiums, it was just a little bit more chill, almost like a rock concert to a degree, because you'd have all this music and powerful speakers. So that kind of, I think, enhanced the whole Christian experience. And it was different than being in the holy building that people associated with. I can't go into that building. It's it's too archaic.
Did you ever experience Ichthus?
I did in Kentucky.
Down in
my
Wilmore,
sister
Kentucky.
And I went to that. That was my first kind of Christian rock experience.
Really?
I thought it was pretty cool.
Do you know what Ichthus is, Andy?
I do know what it is. I also know that I have never been.
Yeah, well, I think it ended before you could have gone, to be honest with you.
Like
there's a small version of it now, and there's different concerts. It has a really obvious name, and I can never remember. Whatever. There's a couple different ones.
Are you talking about like the one in Michigan?
Yeah.
Big Ticket?
Yeah, that one.
Are you gone to that? Yeah, it's kind of like, this is a bad analogy, like Christian Woodstock, maybe, but clean.
I like that you said bad analogy. Of all the places I thought this episode was going, Woodstock was not on the list. That
Put the Christian
fantastic.
on it. We're worshiping God.
My parents went to Ichthus, and they really enjoyed that as well. And I think there is something that's a little bit less, but even that shift of that wanting to be outside of the church building because of those bad stigmas, I think shows this shift in culture and how church was perceived. Yeah. And I don't know that the church ever actually caught up to that. I think one of the big problems is that when you grow up in a place that you love so dearly, right? Like you have that community, you have that. You talked a lot about that being your family.
Yeah.
And that's your experience with church. I mean, that's your heart, right? Your heart is in this place. And then you have an experience like my own, where my heart is very not necessarily in that place.
Right.
Very much so with Christianity and loving. I love the church with the capital C, and I want to see the church become what you experienced again. That's my desire. That's why
Right.
why I went into ministry. But I think in order for that to happen, we have to have these hard conversations. And it's really difficult for us to sit down and have these conversations because we have such different experiences, from Heidi to Andy and me in between. I wanted to do something cool there, but it was
There's
only
quite
cool
a
in my
gap. I
head.
must admit, there's a bigger gap between you and I and you and Andy, but we won't go there.
We don't need to talk about that part. But sometimes I wonder, technology-wise, there might be a bigger gap between me and Andy than there is between us.
Not when dealing with the church, but yes.
But fair. But I think we've seen this almost generational war come out of church, right?
Yep.
I
That's
feel
true.
like
That is true.
we saw it in the Christian praise music movement, contemporary versus hymns. We see it in a lot of different ways played out where older generations don't like the ideas of new generations want nothing to do with the older generations. And I think they've never really just sat down and tried to understand each other and understand that they're talking about two totally different entities. Honestly, though. Like, I know as somebody who is very much so, I have experienced change so much in my life that I can change on a dime, and it's not an issue for me most of the time. Sometimes it is, but most of the time. Whereas for other people, it's like your whole life has been this same way. I want to see things change very desperately, but why would you change from something good? Which would be the perspective of someone older. And sometimes I forget as someone who's younger that walking into a place and just being like, everything you're doing is wrong. That's really bad and can be really insensitive. And it also turns people off to what you might be saying. What you might say is absolutely 100% correct. But if nobody can hear you, then what was the point?
Yeah.
Right? You didn't really. Are you doing that then in Christian love, or are you doing it to prove a point?
Right.
And while I think there is merit to looking at and really evaluating, I think we would be better serviced. And what I try to do myself now that I am a pastor is try to hear people's stories. Like, why is this really archaic thing super important to people? And a lot of times it comes back to, it reminds them of the time when the church was more like a family for them. Or maybe they still feel that same attachment because it is still that place for them. But what they don't seem to understand is that it's not that place for the younger generation anymore. And so it's like I think both generations have a desire for that to be what church is. They want church to be a place where they're loved and accepted, where it's a family. But they both experience that in such different ways that they can't even converse sometimes because they're looking at things from totally different perspectives, because the idea of church has changed so much. You know, when I'm talking about church, I'm coming with the idea that most of the people I knew didn't go to church. With the idea that, yeah, we say we're doing outreach, but who are we actually reaching? Are we really reaching ourselves? Because if we're really reaching ourselves, is that outreach, or is that just patting yourself on the back? But for people who are really invested in those, they probably were outreach at the beginning when they started. And that's still important and valid, but it moved past its purpose. And sort of that one, the term we often use now is that sunsetting. How do we sunset things appropriately? And I just don't know that churches are very good at having those conversations where we can understand one another. Because if you look at someone and say, I know you love this, and I know your heart is here, that it did so many things for your family, but it's just not doing that anymore. And at this point, it's excluding people. I think you can grieve with them in a sense. And there's this ability to see that. But if you just come in and say, this sucks, it needs to change, then there's automatically this off-putting. And in the same way, when a new idea comes in, Sometimes it's like, well, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to handle this? Is the way the church has always done it. That's very off-putting, and it makes younger generations feel like they're not invited to be a part of the table, like their voices don't matter. And so why would they want to be a part of that if their voices don't matter? So I think there's a lot of merit. Sorry, this was a long rant about, I think there's a lot of merit in just trying to understand one another. And I think you're not always going to come to a perfect solution, but I do think you'll feel more like a family that way.
Yeah. It's like anything, you have to be good at articulating or saying how you feel, but then taking that time to really listen to somebody and hear their heart. What is it that's a turnoff to you? What is it that we could do better? How could, the message of the gospel has not changed. That God has not changed. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. But somehow or another, we as the culture, maybe to our fault as the church, have tried to be so cool, relevant. Let's be a new cool coffee shop. Let's keep changing like the culture does. We can't keep up with that. I mean, we know technology is changing so fast. We can't attempt to change like that, but we can be listening and learning and adapting so that the things that can change, whether that's music or whatever, we're not changing who Jesus is. We're not changing those essentials of the faith. We're changing the things that, make it so that people feel welcome. People feel invited in. People feel, wow, this is a place where I hear truth and grace. And, two important concepts of Christianity. I think another thing that's interesting is that we used to think of inviting people to come with us to church. And now maybe it's because of living here in pandemic times and post-flood and everything that's gone on in our specific area, but even in the world, we're thinking more of the church as going out, of being sent. And really, that then you're meeting people on their turf where it is comfortable. And if they get to know you and have a relationship with you, then they might say, well, let me try that place where you worship, but not to come into the building. We're not back in the 1950s where if you move to Midland, Michigan, you might, look for a church. That doesn't always happen so much with young people. That's not like find a doctor, find a church, put it on the checklist. No, that's not happening.
I don't even know how to find a doctor.
We're still struggling with the first one. So really, maybe it is on the checklist. We just haven't hit number 1 yet.
But we need to be willing to go out. And that's convicting because we're not just a Christian when we're inside the building. We really should be that Christian outside the walls of the building.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, is the love of Christ showing when we're in the grocery store, when we're in the long line of traffic, or when we're at our kids' football game, and it's getting heated? Really, that's the time to me where you're witnessing. Andy's smiling. He's like, I've seen some parents in bleachers before. But it is true that people see who you are when you leave the building. Just saying.
No, absolutely. And also, it is important that on that, in your sanctuary as well and in your church, that you're not, or that you are a welcome place. It's very difficult if you might have the best outreach ministries in the world, but then if someone comes to church on Sunday and they bring their, 8-year-old kid, and the first thing that happens is their 8-year-old kid gets yelled at by somebody for not following the rules. Okay, bye.
Right.
That's the end of the story. So there's sort of this
training, I would say, too, of our people, because they're just, I don't want to say our people, but people that are already invested in the church, that if somebody comes in and they don't know or they don't understand or they don't behave the way you think they should, the last thing you want to do is be intimidating and criticizing. That's a huge turnoff. It is.
Absolutely. And it's difficult, I think, because a lot of times when that gets brought up, people, one, either don't realize they're doing it, or two, well, but that's how you behave in church. Well, that's how you used to behave in church. Maybe that's again, it's that total generational gap where that was an expectation at one point, that you came and you were there every week and you know how to sit in the pew, you wear your nicest clothes, you do this, that, and the other thing. But what they didn't realize was they were excluding people. And they never saw that because they had full pews, full sanctuaries, and we're like, we're okay now. We hit our building max, we're fine. But there were people who felt very oppressed by that. And we know that because then we watched numbers go down. If it was really so amazingly investing, then it would have stayed that way in the people's lives. If it was a transformative experience, people would still have continued. But we saw that church numbers went down. there was a nosedive because it was exclusionary. And so now we look at those things and we say, it's sort of like, having had Lily 2 years ago, the rules of parenting change every 5 seconds. For my mom, I think it was babies had to sleep on their sides or sleep on their backs, because if you slept on your stomach, then you might, you didn't. You slept on your stomach. You didn't sleep on your back, because if you slept on your back, you could choke. Your baby would choke, and then choke on whatever fluid it had.
Right.
Then for the side, it was like, you buy these like side prop things to try to get. I don't know. Every time it changes, and then whenever you're a new parent, you're like, for us, it was lay the baby on the back. That's what you do. That's safe sleep protocol. And when I would find that a lot of times I'd tell people that, and they'd be like, I put my baby like this, and they survived. It's like, that's great. That's awesome. Some didn't, though. And that's the thing that people don't always see.
Right.
Is like, that's totally fine, but now we've learned more and grown.
And this is so relevant because, as you know, I have a 3-month-old grandbaby.
Exactly.
And my daughter is the one in charge. And so I say, how do you want it done? You
Yep.
know, like, she's the mom. I'm not.
Well, and
but
it's
the
tough,
back to
right?
sleep thing is, I understand it. There's science behind that.
But it's weird. And you know what? Who knows in 10 years what it'll be?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah.
And I'm sure at some point I will look at Lily and be like, nope, that's not how we did it when you were a baby. But sometimes I think we do that to our own detriment, unintentionally.
Right.
But
Like, it worked for me. Why can't it, And granted, there are some things maybe we shouldn't have let go.
Yes.
There are some things that, we've lost, and that's not good. But at the same time, Jesus was just always so relevant with whoever he was with. And, obviously he saw inside people's hearts. But the more Christ-like we can be in compassion and understanding and listening, it doesn't mean we compromise our standards.
yes.
Okay. And, God is still holy. And there are things that are unchanging about God's nature. And I think sometimes we forget that, even in the church, that people are searching for something different. They don't want to come to church and have it be just like a rock concert or
more the same.
or a movie.
There
needs to be something, and it's the message of the gospel, I think. But how you present it can be different, but don't change the main thing. Keep the main thing, and that's keep Jesus in the center.
Oh yeah, and I think that's the balance that we find, those two extremes. Either we never change anything and we don't touch anything, or it's everything is changed and completely different. We don't even mention Jesus in the service or things like that, and I think that's its own detriment as well. They're both. Yeah, they're both
Two
interesting.
ditches, right?
Yep.
Two ditches.
It's finding that middle ground of, okay, no, we are a Christian church. Our center is in Christ, in the Gospels. How do we present this in a way that people can see God and see God's love?
Yeah.
Because that's the church's real job, is to be that shining light. It talks about the light on a hill, about that place that shows that light to everyone else. We're not the place that judges everybody, that does all of these things. There's so few of those absolutes, but we can't throw the absolutes out. We absolutely need to hold on to those. And I guess I can't say there's so few of them. There are a lot of absolutes, but we need to be very careful which ones we let be absolutes. Yeah. So I'm going to ask both of you guys a question, since I have dominated so much of our episode with my explaining exactly where we were coming from with this one, but I hope it was okay for everyone. And my question to you, I'll start with Andy this time, since I put Heidi in the hot seat last time.
Thank you.
Is church important to you? And I mean church, not necessarily faith, just church.
Mm-hmm. No.
Why?
That's my simple answer. To me, church is really, really, really has just become the building. Mm-hmm. I think that faith and community is still insanely important. Mm-hmm. But I think that a lot of emphasis of church has become the building, the board of trustees, the other thing that we're doing in our building. Mm-hmm. And it's like this whole kind of a thing. The thing like about focusing on community and faith. My biggest, like the thing that has had the biggest impact on me in my faith Negatively has been the church. Positively has been church camp. It's been youth group. It's been Wednesday night, whatever you want to call it, events. Potlucks in the park with like your congregation, like that kind of a thing. But going into a church on a Sunday morning, or like going to the church, has just never had positive impacts for me. And so it's been this whole like, how can I have the church without having the church part of it? It's
You want the big C church, not so interested in the little C church.
yeah, and even then I would say I don't want church, I want Christ. I want community. I want the parts that are supposed to be emphasized in church but get lost. And that's why I say like church camp is, I don't even like calling it church camp. Christian camp, whatever you want to call it. I went to Lake Michigan, which is in Pentwater area, which is, I think, one of the better camps that we have. My brother would say it's Wesley Woods. My sister would say it's Albright, which sadly has, or no, she would say Kennewick, which sadly has
Closed.
been sold.
Yep.
But I think those were the most impactful parts of like me becoming a part of the Christ community, of me learning about things, of looking at my counselor, who, best guy in the world, his name is Joel. He was a pastor's kid like myself, who came from like a broken past from himself, for himself, and just was able to share these like stories with us and be able to like learn with us and teach with us and all this kind of a thing. But none of it felt degrading at all. Like you go to a camp and you get to run around, you get to like embrace camp, you get to like do all this kind of stuff. I go to a church, I still run around, but especially when I was younger,
You just get funnier looks.
yeah, you get funnier looks, you get don't run in the hallways, you get like all this kind of a thing. Luckily in Whitehall, which is a church where like I spent my younger 7 years, we had a gymnasium kind of thing, which encouraged the whole running around, that kind of a thing, which was phenomenal. But it was like the church aspect has just, it hurts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fair. And so, Heidi, I'm going to ask you the exact same question. Is church important? And why?
I'll say yes, but I am hearing Andrew, because I think a lot of people have experienced that hurt that he's talking about, and that it's sad, because I know that turns people off, and sometimes forever. Thankfully, you're able to see there's something bigger here going on that God is doing at camp or wherever, in a setting where it's not so rule laden, if you will. But I know that Scripture, I was looking up to see where this was, in Hebrews 10:24 and 25. I like the Message because it's kind of a cool version. Sometimes it says, in Hebrews 10:24 and 25, let's keep a firm grip on the promises that keep us going. He always keeps his word, God. Let's see how inventive we can be in encouraging love and helping out, not avoiding worshiping together as some do, but spurring each other on, especially as we see the big day approaching, when Christ would come again. So God commands us to meet together. We are supposed to worship. We are supposed to worship, I think, for the sense of praising God in community. There's power when you're together. For accountability, I know in small groups, that's where we kind of sharpen one another, whether it's keeping each other accountable about stuff or encouraging each other. If somebody's going through depression, you got to have that small group. I'm big on small groups, because it is, you could go into a worship service and leave and feel like, okay, check the box, I went to church today, but you don't have that sense of community that Andrew's really craving. And I think you do get that in the camp experience, but on a regular basis, I think we can get that in church, small church C, who worships the big the big C, Christ. But in that, we do need to, my generation and all the way down to yours. I think there's a couple between us, right? From I'm like end of baby boomers down to
There's Gen X and then millennial. So
okay.
just the one.
Right.
And
Okay.
it gets forgotten most of the time.
Right.
Sorry, Gen Xers who listen, but you really do get forgotten.
But
so
what
often.
not working? You know, what are
Yep.
we doing? What are the things that are not essential? It's like, you know, do we have to have these church pews set up like this? I know you did one on church pews.
We did our first one.
Your first one, I listened
First
to that.
ever.
But, you know, what is it that's going to be more conducive to the church being more relevant and being more appealing, I guess, to those who are, you know, young parents that want community and want to know, hey, I'm struggling with this with my child. Yeah, me too. You know, there is power in being with people in a structured manner to encourage each other because you're going through the same stuff in life. And, you know, I've been in some smaller groups within a church like that that really help couples in their marriages, help, you know, parents. You know, there's a group of people who might all have special needs kids and they need that encouragement. And they can be in the house of God and say, yeah, you know what, we're all struggling with this. Let's pray together. So those components of prayer and worship and, you know, experiencing the power of the sacraments, I just see all that is so important, but not to turn a blind eye to the stuff that's a turnoff to the millennial Gen Z generation. Yep. I don't think we could also expect to keep up technology-wise. I mean, thank goodness Andrew's helped us so much these last few months at this church. You know, we couldn't have gotten through the pandemic without, you know, your skills. It's been amazing. So we so appreciative of that. But yeah, remember what's relevant. Keep Christ in the center. The things that are essential, hang on to those. And the other stuff, we got to let it go. Let it go. Let it go. Is your daughter too young for Frozen?
Oh, gosh. Is she too young or have we purposely steered
kept
away?
that out of that.
Those are good questions.
Okay. I hope I answered that correctly.
No,
I'm long-winded.
I don't think there is a correct or incorrect way to answer this question. I think much like all of the topics we try to bring here, there's room for discussion and growth.
Yeah.
And I see both of yours. I guess my passion is to see what Andy's talking about become what church is. So I acknowledge that right now church is not where people are getting that, but how can we become that? And that's sort of where I guess maybe in that way I'm sort of like the bridge. No, just
between
kidding.
the generations and between the
but that the idea that right now I feel more spiritually fed from small group conversations with my friends that exist outside of necessarily the local church. But how can we bring back the local church to make it so that way that group of friends would feel comfortable meeting here?
Yeah.
So I think that's where my heart resides in the middle of all of this. Is church important? I believe community is important, and I believe that what Scripture says is 100% true. Wherever two or more are gathered, there I am as well. And so that having that community of people, whether that's inside of an established church or not, is so important. Because you know, we weren't called to live in isolation. We were called to live in community.
Yeah.
But how that is expressed can be very different. And I did like what you said also as well about the sacraments and the importance of those. And that is something that you get through the local church that you might not get in a smaller community setting. But I think one thing also is that we have to explain why those are important again. Because there's kind of a disconnect between why can't a small community of friends do that? Or can they? Is that just as acceptable as anyone in a local church offering communion or baptism or you know, those different things, especially not that in the Protestant church, marriage isn't considered a sacrament. However, you can go online and get the license to wed in like 30 minutes if you really want to. So that it's not even like that necessity anymore of you have to go get them to get your wedding official. So yeah, I think that there is, I think where my heart is again is to see the church building become important again because it's starting to be the community that it's supposed to be. That's my heart. And how to get there? Well, we're still working on that.
Yeah.
And
I think we've been looking at the early church and Acts and some of those important components of meeting together and praying and, and being in scripture and fellowshipping. And those are relational. And I think that's the one thing, as Andy was saying, we've got these different committees in churches, but let's get back to what the heart of it is relationships. And without that, it just becomes this, check the box. I brushed my teeth. I went to church. I did this. I did that. Okay, week is fine. It's like, no, God has it's like, Jesus always expanded, the idea of, don't even look at a woman lustfully. Yep. That's adultery or whatever. That he expanded the idea. And so it's not just go be in a building for 30 minutes dressed up nicely and listen to a message and feel good about yourself and pat yourself on the back, but take how that message that you heard that was so amazing on Sunday and go live it, go be Christ to somebody wherever.
Absolutely. And I think even this podcast is an expression of growth within the church and showing a different way to have these conversations and to talk about our faith in a context that is a little bit weird for a church. But we have reached the end of our time. And so I'd like to thank you again, Heidi, for joining us. And hopefully we can steal you another day sometime for another
great.
conversation.
I enjoyed this with Andy and you.
And so, I'd like to remind you again that you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. And if you would like to listen to our supplemental Bible study, that is available under the name Church is Stupid, but Bible Study Edition, not on this page particularly, but on its own separate page on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and more. So, from all of us here at Church is Stupid,
but
I'm Ruth.
I'm Andy.
I'm Heidi.
And we hope you have an excellent week.